So, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson, America's 28th president. You might know him as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a progressive visionary, the man who dreamed of a new world order. But what if I told you that same man championed racial segregation and held a private screening in the White House for a film that celebrated the Ku Klux Klan? Well, that's the Woodrow Wilson paradox, and we're about to dive in.
I mean, just look at this. On one hand, you have the distinguished statesman, the intellectual president. And on the other, you have a man whose own history books were quoted in the film The Birth of a Nation to give legitimacy to the Ku Klux Klan. It's a shocking contrast, and it's right at the heart of his story.
So who was he, really? Was he the progressive leader pushing for a new freedom, or a regressive figure who actively rolled back civil rights? The thing is, to really get a handle on the man, you have to look at both sides of the coin. And that's exactly what we're going to do.
All right, let's start with the version of Wilson that captured the country's imagination, the reformer. This is the story of Wilson the Progressive, the architect of a bold new domestic plan he called the New Freedom.
And when we say his rise was fast, we are not kidding. The guy was the only U.S. president to ever hold a Ph.D. He goes from being the president of Princeton University to the governor of New Jersey, and then just 2 years after that, boom, he's in the White House. He was brilliant, incredibly ambitious, and a really powerful speaker.
And he didn't just show up to the White House with a smile. Oh no, he had a plan. His New Freedom agenda wasn't just some catchy slogan. It was a huge, sweeping program of new laws meant to tackle what he called the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banks, and trusts.
First on his hit list, tariffs. The Revenue Act of 1913 cut them way down. But you gotta make up for that lost government money somewhere, right? So the act also created the modern federal income tax. And this was a huge deal. It wasn't just another tax. It fundamentally changed how the U.S. government funds itself. And it's basically this system we still have today.
Next up, the banks. The nation's financial system was, to put it mildly, a mess. It was unstable, prone to panics. Wilson's solution was the Federal Reserve Act. This created the central banking system we now call the Fed, designed to manage the money supply and prevent financial collapse. It was an absolutely massive piece of legislation, and it's easily one of his longest-lasting legacies.
And finally, the trusts, those giant corporations that had a stranglehold on the economy. Wilson came at them with a 1-2 punch. First, he created the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to act as a corporate watchdog. Then, he put more teeth into the laws against monopolies with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which outlawed specific shady business practices.
So you can see his domestic work was completely transformative. But even as he was busy reshaping America at home, a massive crisis was exploding across the Atlantic. And it was about to force him and America onto the world stage like never before.
When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Wilson wanted nothing to do with it. He was dead set on keeping the U.S. neutral. In fact, he won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And for nearly 3 years, he did exactly that.
But then, two things happened that forced his hand. First, Germany started its unrestricted submarine warfare again, sinking American ships. Then came the real bombshell, the Zimmerman telegram. This was a secret message where Germany tried to get Mexico to attack the United States. Well, the American public was outraged. Neutrality was officially off the table.
In April 1917, America was at war. But for Wilson, this wasn't just about winning. It was about what came after. He laid out this grand vision for a new kind of world in his famous 14 points, a really radical plan for lasting peace, built on things like open diplomacy, free trade, and the right of people to choose their own government.
And the absolute cornerstone of this whole vision, the 14th and most critical point, was his idea for a General Association of Nations. This, of course, would become the League of Nations, an organization he believed could prevent a world war from ever happening again. And this was his moment of glory. For his incredible effort to build this new, peaceful world, Woodrow Wilson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919. In Europe, people hailed him as a hero, a savior. But while Wilson was being celebrated as a global champion of democracy, a very, very different story was playing out back home. And this is where we have to confront that darker, deeply troubling side of the Wilson paradox.
Take a look at this draft card. While Wilson was preaching about self-determination for people in Europe, his own military was strictly segregated. You had African-American soldiers drafted to fight for freedoms overseas that they themselves were completely denied back home. The contradiction is just jarring.
And it went way beyond the military. Wilson's administration, with the first Southerner as president since the Civil War, oversaw the systematic segregation of the federal government. Federal workplaces, restrooms, even cafeterias were segregated. This rolled back decades of hard-won progress and was devastating for the growing black middle class who had seen federal jobs as a pathway to a better life.
And then there's this, which might be the most infamous part of it all. Wilson hosted a screening of The Birth of a Nation right there in the White House, the very first movie ever shown there. This film was a horribly racist story that portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. And to give it a veneer of academic authority, the movie actually used direct quotes from Woodrow Wilson's own history books.
So how do we make sense of these two people in one body, the global peacemaker and the president who entrenched segregation? Well, the final years of his presidency only make the whole picture more complicated. His greatest international achievement, the League of Nations, actually became his biggest political failure. He came back from the peace conference in Paris to a Senate that had serious doubts about the treaty. But Wilson, always the idealist, refused to compromise at all. And because of that stubbornness, the United States never actually joined the League of Nations. That failure, on top of a massive stroke that left him seriously ill, just shattered his political career. These maps tell the whole story. On the left, you see his narrow victory in 1916. Now look at the right, just 4 years later, his party suffers an absolute landslide defeat. The American people had turned their back on his vision. So in the end, his legacy is just this study in stark contrasts. You've got the Federal Reserve and the modern income tax, which are monumental achievements, but they're right there on the ledger next to his administration's racist policies and his biggest political blunders. It's a balance sheet with incredible highs and truly awful lows.
Which leads us to the final question, one that people are still debating. When we look back at a leader like Woodrow Wilson, how do we weigh their grand ideals against their damaging actions? There is no easy answer. And that, in a nutshell, is the Woodrow Wilson paradox.